BC of the Masters in Professional Communications, and she's in. We just found out she lives in my hometown in central Alberta and works for the city of Red Deer. So, Melissa, turn it over to you, and looking forward to your talk, Dr. Lee. Thanks for being here as well.
Thank you, Chase. Can everyone hear me? I will assume so. Perfect. Okay. So hello, thank you for joining us. So thanks for the introduction. I'm Melissa Giroux, a recent graduate from the MAPC program, and I'm happy to introduce our next speaker. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees ancestors, and these lands now house the Royal Roads University campus. I myself am situated on Treaty 6 territory, which are the traditional lands of the Blackfoot, Cree, and Métis people. So we are grateful to live and learn on these lands and respect the history, languages, and cultures which continue to influence our communities and our ways of life. Our next speaker, Dr. Lee Foote, brings a unique experience and a fresh perspective to our conference. With an expertise in habitat ecology, Dr. Foote served as director for the University of Alberta's Botanic Gardens and was a professor of conservation biology prior to his recent retirement. He was a long-standing member for the board of directors for the Alberta Conservation Association, served as an advisor in the 2013 Alberta Wetland Policy, and was also a member of the Alberta Game Policy Advisory Committee. And last year, Dr. Foote was awarded the William Rowan Lifetime Achievement Award by the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society. Throughout his career, his research focused on wetland management, disturbance, reclamation, and wildlife habitat, and had a strong emphasis on the sustainable use of natural resources. He's also contributed to significant research on sustainability of threatened species and has been involved with projects on trumpeter swans, peregrine falcons, and polar bears, to name a few. So as a strong advocate for conservation and sustainable use, Dr. Foote is no stranger to defending challenging or unpopular positions. He takes on this role with confidence as he speaks up regularly as an advocate for the benefits and need of hunting to those who are against the activity. So I am glad to welcome Dr. Foote to share his experiences and speak to the ethical challenges of defending controversial viewpoints. For those tuning in, we encourage you to share your questions through the chat throughout the presentation, and I will pose them to Dr. Foote at the end of the presentation on your behalf. So without any further delay, welcome, Dr. Foote.
Dr. Elder Butch warned us early on to not prejudge. People form their opinions of another person in the first 10 seconds, and those have to be either exacerbated or unwound over time. I'm a white man, an immigrant. I come from Alberta most recently. I have a Southern accent. I'm talking to you today about a controversial topic of hunting. What are we to make of this? It gets worse. I also play the 5-string banjo and I train hunting dogs. How could you not put someone like me in a very small, tight, stereotypical box? You're welcome to judge later on, but I ask you to suspend your pigeonholing for the time being. You may be spot on, but you may be surprisingly wrong. So with that little request, I'm going to switch gears and start my actual presentation now. I'd like to thank Dr. Emma Lard, Glendora, Bob Remington, who got me into this in the first place, and Melissa for that wonderful introduction. I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in BC's Lower Mainland. I've traded my affiliation on the treaty lands of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Beaver in central Alberta, most recently with a move out here. But this begs a deeper question. Where do I really come from? I really come from the central part of Louisiana, a land filled with a rich but also terrifically difficult history of indigenous rights and racism and slavery. It's a place of the Attakapaw, the Choctaw, the Biloxi, the Natchez, the Homas, the Chitimacha. These are essentially extinct cultures now, driven out by disease, by exploitation, by land grabs, and the series of 5 different nations that held this in the purest of colonial sense. So as I unpack the history of indigeneity and learn more about it, I have lots of things to really think about. I'm heartened by what appears to be a strong indigenous participation today and the many different perspectives that will probably be brought to what hunting actually means. This is important because we come to this from different perspectives. Now, communications is tough. We know that. The earlier speakers really wound us up on that pretty well. And controversial topics are tough. Even public speaking is tough. Public speaking frightens people to a greater degree than heights, snakes, spiders, and in some cases, even death. This doesn't feel terribly public because I'm sitting in my bedroom, but the fact that I'm speaking to 200 to 500 people could be rather ungluing. What I'd like to do today, though, is deal with this controversial topic of hunting as an example. It could just as easily have been about politics or religion or raising children or climate change or animal use. These are all those controversial topics we need to practice our chops. So maybe today, because I've done this a little bit, we'll have a chance to talk some about that. I'll try to communicate about this topic in as open a way as possible where you understand my perspective, but you're allowed lots of freedom to have your own perspective. And differing perspectives are a wonderful thing. For example, Francis Scott Fitzgerald once said, and I may butcher this quote, "The best mark of a first-rate mind is the ability to hold 2 conflicting opinions at the same time without going mad." So philosophy requires that of us. Academia requires that of us, to think about different perspectives and not leap to judge. We're not in a black and white and binary world, even though the train experiment in the earlier presentation tried to force us and put sideboards on us to make a decision, either turn left or kill the 5 people. That's not the real world. We have the latitude and flexibility to move between and adjust and modify and actually change our mind, unlike a train running over an individual. So today I'll try to, this communication thing, wish me luck. The first wish me luck is I try to move to opening my presentation. Let's see how I do with that. Okay, and I have to turn on share screen at some point. Well, I'm afraid I might have lost you here.
If you go down to the bottom, you should be able to see share screen highlighted in green.
Yes.
It kind of disappears until you hover your mouse over it.
Okay, well, I've actually lost my entire Zoom presentation. Can you see me?
We can see you.
Okay, then I've got to find you. At my risk, I'm going to hit join a meeting again because I really can't see you. And I can't bring up the screen share either. I'll back out. Maybe I can back up there.
And I've got your presentation slides too, so.
Okay, screen now back to screen share. So thank you for your forbearance. And I think that this should probably do it. Are we good?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Okay. These are difficult topics to think about, and throw a little technology on top of that, and an old guy like me struggles a bit. So here's artwork. This is, and I want to start this presentation by context. And I want to challenge you, and your first reaction to this next slide might be one of, what the heck? But I'll make a bold statement. For us to live, other sentient beings must die. Sometimes you see this given as something else must die. Maybe it's a broccoli or a wheat stem, as in this case, or others. But this mob of gulls is doing something a little different. Gulls and crows follow the plow because they are feeding. Now, a little trigger warning, these are rather graphic slides. There's one other picture later in here of a polar bear with a little blood on it, but those are the only things that are really, I think, out there. We don't really think about the green footprint of our existence, the train on the track, if you will. Which track do we take? Even though we try to minimize our green footprint. For the last 2 weeks, my wife and I have been vegans as an experiment during COVID, something to do. We don't normally eat that way, and it was okay. But as I thought about that, I realized we are drawing sustenance nutrition from the earth in places that used to produce a bounty of wildlife each year. Our needs mean that mainland, bottomland forest is no more. It's now a plowed field. Or that rice field that was once a natural wetland is now a managed flooded rice field. Animals that live there every generation are no more. So what of this? The forestry, the car I drive, it causes cut lines through central Alberta to provide the fuel, and that helps the demise of caribou. There are tendrils and implications to everything we do, and it's a very, very sticky conundrum we face. I want to tell you a little story about Spot, my cat. Now, this is not really Spot, but you've probably seen this play out. Spot would sit at the window of our den and watch the birds feeding at the bird feeder right outside. When a bird landed, Spot would crouch. His paws would start to sweat a little bit. He would make a funny little meowing sound. His tail would twitch. His pupils would dilate. His breathing would become fast. His heart rate would increase. And we all thought, that's very cute. We have a little wild predator living this out in our own house. Now, let me tell you another story. If you were hiking along the Juan de Fuca Trail or through Elk Island National Park or Adirondacks National Park with a group of friends chatting, and you come around a corner and you see a herd of elk or a deer or a black bear, you know what'll happen. I can tell you what will happen because you're not in control of this. You would crouch, your pupils would dilate, your paws would start to sweat lightly, your pulse would increase. You might even experience what's called piloerectile involuntary function. That just means the hair would stand up on your arms and the back of your neck so you look bigger and more ferocious. You would have channeled from your amygdala the inner workings of your inner predator for fight or flee. You would have adopted this without any thinking. Now, earlier when we heard a really beautiful exposition from Dr. Romillard about the power of language and communication. When you whirl and give that look to your friends and make that funny little noise that says, there's some elk right there. When you do that, you are communicating before you said a word. Your body language, your posture, your attitude towards the world would convey there's something there. So I love this because it suggests that we are linked to the natural world in ways that go beyond the higher levels of cognition, of communication, of abstraction, conceptualization, religion, even necessity. This is a deep monkey brain, crocodilian brain, amygdala response to an external stimulus. So it's nice that we carry this instinctive connection. And I really appreciate that. So my next slide, if you're a Stevie Wonder fan, you might think we are the world, and that's sort of where we're going with this. We share a tremendous number of values. It's very hard to find any user, non-user, religious group that doesn't share these first steps. We all want clean air. We all want clean, protected water sources that we can trust and depend on. Texas has been through a lot of this lately. Virtually everyone wants abundant habitat, appropriate levels of biodiversity, healthy, abundant wildlife populations, hunting of harvestable surpluses. Whoa, wait, not so fast on that last one. So I think that hunting of harvestable surpluses can be a very good thing. But really the gist of this is that when you find area of disagreement with somebody, we tend to focus on just the disagreement and not all that we have in common. And so the work, whether you're working for the Sea Shepherd Society or you're hunting or a hunting organization, remember that the first 5, 6 steps of this ladder you share with all of society. So let's disarticulate this hunting thing a little bit. First, how do we even arrive at our beliefs and ethical frameworks? Where do these come from? This card on the right was sent to me by a wildlife biologist friend one Christmas, and I saved it, and they actually challenged her about it. I said, Ronnie, what did you really mean by that card? If we were to animate this card, we would probably see the weasel grab the rabbit by the throat, the polar bear or the wolf would probably grab the caribou, the owl would be, it'd be a field of blood. This is not the lamb lies down with the lion here. This is a fantasy. This is something that's been brought up as an emotional construct, what some people title Disneyfication. So, and it has some interesting implications as far as the Bambi movie, which I found very moving as a child. But over time, we start to blur the lines of difference between humans and wildlife. Now, there's a tremendous amount that we do share, but there are some things that are fundamentally different and distinct, I think. I'll talk more about this in a little while. So this really became apparent to me. My colleagues and I, my students and I, have published 2 papers in recent years, one on polar bears, one on grizzly bears, and how the media has treated those. Sometimes they're sympathetic, sometimes they're factual, but by and large, the media has treated grizzly bears with almost like Sharknado, the sensationalism of a large predator that can be a threat and can cause an emotional hook to us and holds the readership. The cynic might say, sell some cars and advertisement in the newspaper, but basically it reaches in and taps our emotion on the shoulder and says, this could happen to you. This is right outside. This is the other. So it's a very interesting treatment. And with print media and dire straits these days, it's understandable that they need to increase readership. And so I understand those pressures. But let's talk a little more about this media form of communication. Whether it's ethical or not, I'm not really set to judge. But if we take that one step on the step ladder of differing, and we see where this goes, a really big problem with this is if the most extreme, most exciting, most newsworthy, the biggest headline gets abstracted from the bigger, broader picture and becomes the featured topic, hunting, trapping, fishing. And it can go a step further. It can even talk about the inhumanity or the resourcefulness of lots of dimensions of that. But it can become poor reporting. And there are errors of omission, conflation, fact, logic, emphasis, source, attribution. There are lots of ways to get this wrong. So I wanted to give a couple of, maybe pop a few bubbles. The bold here are common claims that I hear. Hunting leads to extinction. When burrowing down a little bit deeper, we realize that most hunted animals, species, are much more common now than they were in, say, 1930. In fact, many have been reintroduced to their former range after being extirpated by earlier excesses. Errors of omission, hunting is dangerous. Well, Badminton reports higher hospitalizable injury rates. It's sort of a man bites dog scenario to think that the things we do, driving to the field to go hunting, is far more dangerous than the act of hunting. Yet we don't give driving a second thought. Errors of conflation. Many of us, me included, have a knee-jerk reaction to seeing a firearm. I live in a condo now, and if someone walks in carrying a gun, I watch them carefully. If it's cased and they're wearing camouflage, I presume they're a hunter. If not, I question their intent. So let's look at the syllogism. Hunters use guns, guns kill people, therefore hunting should be outlawed. But that's a false syllogism. When we take this apart, less than 2% of all firearms deaths each year are hunting-related accidents, and that constitutes to 1 to 5 people per year across Canada. It's not a huge mortality rate. It's grievous, it's unfortunate, it's troubling, but it's not in the same league as COVID deaths, automobile deaths, alcohol poisoning, bee stings even. It's not a big player on the mortality screen. Errors of logic. Animal death is cruel, thus hunting is wrong. Animal death is essentially always cruel, regardless of the source. All animals die, and what is the cruelest death? I'll take a little vignette. One of the wolf biologists from here in British Columbia, one of my former students, Jerry Cusick, studied wolves. He said, virtually no dominant male wolf lives more than 5.5 years. He said that they get stomped by stomped by moose, they have fights, they have territorial disputes, they have broken canines, broken jaws. It's a very difficult life and a high turnover. I'm not a wolf hunter. I never opt to hunt wolves or really any predators, but some do, and trappers certainly do. Yet the deaths caused by this harvest or this kill, this offtake, is no less cruel than the natural fate of these animals, and it does provide some utility to the people that are pursuing this for fur or whatever. I'll get to sport hunting later. I think that leaps to mind. So these are just some thoughts. These are all nuanced topics that you could spend a lot of time talking about and rebutting, actually. What I don't want to do here is try to give you a sell job that hunting is good. I live in a family with three women. None of them are hunters. They're neither anti nor strongly pro, and we give each other room to hold different beliefs, although they all do eat my venison gumbo and elk steaks. In communicating difficult or emotionally fraught topics, there are movements against rodeo, there are movements against the whale hunt, it's an old slide, but there are movements against trapping, and they ebb and wane and increase over time. But it's helpful to remember that most of these are strongly agenda-driven topics. Those of you that are old enough will remember the child soldier, the Coney thing that blew up on the scene. Deeply emotional, children evoke these strong protective instincts, as do animals, the helpless, dumb creatures. So these are easy buttons to push with the public, and unfortunately, some media and certainly the propaganda crowd can't help pushing these buttons. They're just too easy and available. It's an old slide, but social media, as has been all over the media lately, can incite people into extreme political positions. Now, one of my students was looking at this slide and said, Dr. Foote, if you look at that just right, it looks like there's something poking out behind the K. And I can never look at that slide now without thinking about that. They also pointed out that this gentleman is being very, very careful with where he puts his hands. So he might have been onto inappropriate touching well before its time. It's probably a 25-year-old photograph. There are pro-animal use organizations. Some of the agriculture folks are very much into beef cattle, rodeo, things like that. There are pro-use groups like Safari Club International, the International Union for Conservation of Nature has a sustainable user specialist group, which surprises some people. The many sportsmen's groups. And some of the distinguishing features of these folks is they focus on populations, not individuals. They share the passion for species welfare with even the anti-use groups. Think of that latter again. This group, for maybe selfish reasons, invests quite a lot more money into habitat and population management than do the anti or non-use groups. They are some of the largest, the Ducks Unlimiteds of the world, the nature conservancies. They are very much land, habitat, maintenance, and preservation. and they're very fervent in supporting their perspectives. Now let's look at the anti-use, and I'm using that as a very broad term. But the protectionist organizations, Humane Society, US, PETA, Sea Shepherd, they tend to focus on the welfare of individual animals and less so on the populations. This is a difficult place because when you focus on an individual and you name them and give them a personality and you invoke the implication that they have rights, and I'll talk about rights in a little while, we feel a personal connection that is usually reserved for human-to-human connection, but in this case, it's a delivery of privileges and rights to this animal. It's a projection of these onto the animal that might not fit. These groups share a passion for species welfare as just like user groups. They support education advocacy, probably put less of their resources towards habitat maintenance, although there's a lot of good that can come from education. And like the other group, they are fervent in supporting their perspectives. These are high-level Madison Avenue quality communication strategies to achieve an end or advance a cause. And if you don't have a huge advertising budget, it's far cheaper to be newsworthy than it is to pay for advertising space and column inches in a newspaper. So the not-for-profits, both sides, rely on the tension, the shock value, the emotional appeals for donations. They've got to feed their organization. And these organizations on both sides take on a self-interested life of their own in advocacy that's sometimes called the conflict industry. In order to create this tension and maintain the headlines and get the news, there's no such thing as bad news coverage to many of these folks. It's important that the conflict rages, and the more the conflict rages, the more attention they're able to hive off to the side. And again, I'm not pointing fingers at any one group. This is a categorical criticism of what's done. And there's a real interesting tendency to deviate from the facts, from the science, from what's known, into what you wish for or your group's position. It's harmonious with your group's position. So some years back in my course, I invited an animal rights professor, Dr. Margaret Vanderpit, who I have great respect for, to come in, and we would do a debate. And she made some excellent points. These are some of the points that she brought forward and her reasons to oppose resourcism. That is taking an animal from a freestanding entity with rights into something that is a resource for humans. And I think this is worth considering. Their cognitive ethology. They have the animals like this crow have the ability to solve problems, use tools. They have a higher level of cognition than most people are willing to cede to them. Self-awareness, some of the research with higher primates using mirrors and mimicking language, sometimes with 300-word vocabularies, suggests that they have an awareness of others. They respond to smiles on screen, things like that. Sentience and autonomy. If you haven't ever Googled up gorilla with a machine gun, it's rather hilarious and horrifying at the same time. It's a YouTube worth seeing, but it suggests that they have a self-awareness and they recognize themselves. They're the object of a life. The pragmatic approach is that we have crops. We don't need to kill animals anymore. But going back to my first 3 slides, we do kill animals by the billions every year when we run harrows, rakes, combines, plows through fields. The absolute level of animal death probably goes up as a result of agriculture each year, if you're just counting sentient bodies. There are weak distinctions between animals and humans, and as we treat animals, we may be prone to treating humans. Bad faith, Sartre's offerings, that is that we misrepresent ourselves badly, and we deliberately separate and other animals from humans for self-interested reasons. And finally, the masked inhumanity. Because we might want to eat chickens, or we displace wildlife, or we hit animals on the highway with our cars, that we want to put on the blinkers, if you will, and not have to address these things. So we call them lesser, non-sentient, more Cartesian approach of they're just a mechanical entity out there. All valid criticisms, all debatable, all can be refuted to some degree, some others not. So I know that my dog, that's me and my dog on the right, she has a vocabulary of at least 25 words. You can't say the W-A-L-K word around or she gets animated, but she knows lots of commands and she responds appropriately to those. So we've come right up to the cusp. Do we confer moral rights to these animals? Are they moral agents? Ultimately, membership in a community of moral agents seems to me to be impossible for non-human animals. Things like ethics and social welfare engagements are really problematic when you do this. Some of the other things that emerge that animals don't seem to do well across species anyway is governance, citizenship, property ownership and maintenance, marriage. One could be even slightly perverse and say they don't maintain interspecific relationships with clear communication. They can't hold contracts very well, because to have a contract or a right, you have to be able to exercise that contract and right. Otherwise, you don't hold it. I think that's legal jargon. If there's a lawyer here, you might straighten me out on that. Most animals don't do higher math particularly well. They don't understand abstraction, future planning beyond the immediate future very well, and the ability to hold or exercise rights. There are small exceptions to many of these that are instinctive. We see squirrels and nutcrackers caching and hiding food for the next winter. It's a very instinctive behavior. It plays out even in the laboratory. It's not a thought out procedure. So animals seem to have some fundamental difference from us, even though we share quite a lot as well. Now, let's get really difficult. What about humans that in extremis may have start with lower cognitive abilities than, say, a well-trained German Shepherd, or like me, ultimately, if I live long enough, I will lose my faculties and drop below the line of sentience. What are the moral distinctions here? What are we dealing with? Well, in Western society, we have chosen in a democratic fashion to recognize all humans as being a class of rights holders under the umbrella of humanity, it's sometimes called. And this is irrespective of the degree of intelligence, of physical prowess, of physical attributes. We extend this for maybe some pragmatic reasons, but interestingly, this hasn't always been the case. In some other societies historically, and even currently, they don't recognize the rights of all people. There are stories in nomadic people, in fact, still in some nomadic cultures. If you're incapable of keeping up with the moving band, you are left to your own devices, which is a death sentence in the Kalahari or in the pack ice. I don't know if that happens in any pack ice cultures. It certainly can in Central Kalahari, though. So when you fall below a level of having your faculties, you're at risk of being considered either non-human or not worth saving. Interesting different set of values. That's not the way we live in the West, though. It's just, how do we judge what is right, though? What is the ethical appropriate? What references do we use? We can define it like Derrida. We can use tradition and just go with what's been done before. We can fall back on science and reason, which is probably my biggest fault as a professional scientist. I tend to drift this way and I have to pull myself back sometimes, which is Rene Descartes' classic Cartesian approach. Historic, economic optimization, what's best for us or best for society. And then one I don't fully understand is the absent referent. It's the C.J. Adams philosophical approach. Maybe some of the philosophers in the group can help me with that later. So now I'll go out on a limb, and this is the gospel according to Lee. These are 3 benchmarks that I just made up. I dwelt on it. I didn't do it lightly, but I think these are defensible in defense of hunting. And let me see if I can communicate those to you. Before I do this, I want to say in our discussion, I love dissenting opinions and I treat them with respect. I don't appreciate ad hominem attacks, but we don't have to go personal or hit below the belt. But I love the ideas of others that see things very different from me. How am I to grow if I'm not if these ideas aren't challenged? And I don't take it as a personal challenge. I take it as an idea sitting out on the table that we can discuss in true Socratic fashion, to talk about and turn it over and kick it around. Okay, these criteria, what I call the Leopold criteria. This is drawn straight from Aldo Leopold, the sort of patron saint of wildlife management. And he had a famous quote where he said, "A thing is right and good when it tends to promote biodiversity. It's wrong when it does otherwise." So my question is, does it promote biodiversity? Is this a good thing or not? The second one is drawn straight from the indigenous traditions of the Cree in Alberta, where I used to work with and hunt. Is this activity sustainable out at least 5 generations? Which I think is a really good benchmark. We are so egocentric and self-centered about our decision-making. We think, how is this going to affect me? And when I'm dead, I don't really much care. Yet traditions and worrying about the future means that we have to think about our great, 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 great grandchildren. And that is the essence of stewardship of the present for the benefit of the future. I like that. It gives us pause to think about what we do now and how that will affect those that follow. You've often heard the trite phrase, we're spending our grandchildren's inheritance. And there's a really difficult one. What is the social acceptability of hunting? Is it like cockfighting that's acceptable to less than 1% of the population? Or is it like bicycling that's acceptable to 95% of the population? At some point, currently in Canada, just under 10% of people currently or previously have hunted. And as that number probably decreases over time, at some point it gets down to the 2 to 5%, and it becomes more of a cult-like activity. And we do live in a democracy, and if this is not acceptable to the majority, then maybe it should be ended. So I don't consider hunting to be a right. I consider it to be a privilege. And with that privilege comes the motivation to be as ethical, as sensitive, as responsible a hunter as one can. It's a self-fulfilling activity. You have to maintain social license to operate in your preferred hobby or activity or life passion or identity in order for it to continue. So market hunting, which doesn't really occur much anymore in North America, it violates all 3 of these criteria. Currently, trophy hunting frequently violates number 3. More than half the people in Canada think that trophy hunting, pure trophy hunting, kill something, take the horns, leave the rest, is an abomination. I tend to agree with them. Yet managed recreational hunting is currently compatible with all 3 of these. And in fact, somewhere around between 70 and 80% of Canadians, depending on which poll you choose to look at, say responsible hunting is okay. Now, I'm going to give you 2 examples where this is another man bites dog sort of scenario, where hunting is being applied to a threatened, endangered, or species of concern. This is essentially trophy hunting, but there's also a lot of use from it. How can one justify or rationalize this? So I call this conservation hunting. I've written 2 books or edited 2 books on this so far, and these are 2 of the examples that really caused me to think. And I hope you'll see and maybe the irony, but also the paradoxes that are woven into this. These wood bison are the single largest land mammal in North America. They were thought to be extinct, but a small herd was found north of what's currently Wood Buffalo National Park. They've been captive bred and re-released into their former habitats. They were only gone for about 400 or 500 years from the landscape, but they were gone, and now they're coming back. And interestingly, and this is in the Champagne-Asiatic indigenous people's lands in Yukon, they've become locally overabundant, which is a real paradox too, to have an endangered species that is overabundant. And what does overabundant mean? Overabundant means they're in conflict with the humans that live there, even though those humans have been there for many, many millennia. The communities there are primarily people of the caribou, and they were concerned about the moose and caribou populations and how this newcomer, although it was there many years ago, is going to affect things like disturbance, competition for habitat and food, introduction of white man's diseases, tuberculosis and Bang's disease, and the change in the predator-prey relationships. If we bolster the wolf populations, then caribou might be the ones that really take it in the neck, while bison are much harder to kill. There were some other emotional aspects of this. The bison were tearing up some of the ancestral burial grounds. They were getting on people's porches. They were rubbing up against buildings. They were knocking down sheds. And most dramatically, they were a big, dark, immovable object on the highway at night, and they had several fatalities, people running into bison. So they were an uncomfortable newcomer. So the solution to this was battered around. They trapped and moved some, but a multi-stakeholder group that represented the indigenous interests, the sport hunting interests, the local consumer interests, the public, they met and met and met and finally came up with a management plan. And one of the primary tools of this was hunting. Hunting becomes a management tool for an endangered species. Who'd have thunk? This little graph, it's a bit old now, but it shows the minimum number known alive. That's the MNKA. You see the gray increasing. Their numbers were started out small and they grew very rapidly. And the very steepest part of this climb made people very uncertain of where is this going? How many are there going to be? Are we going to be overrun with these protected animals? So agreement was made somewhere between 400 and 500 was a good social carrying capacity. What people could live with would ensure the future of the genetics of these bison. So they introduced a hunt. And you see the blue offtake down the lower right corner. And that slowed the population growth, but it didn't stop it. I called up last week and talked to Thomas Young, a colleague and friend of mine. He said the 2020 population is over 1,500 bison and growing despite an active hunting season. So that's 3 times the maximum social carrying capacity. And hunting alone is not effective in stopping it. It's helping, but it's not the full answer. And they're not exactly sure what they're going to do. Okay, I think the next slide is the one with the bloody polar bear. If you're bothered by that, you might want to turn your screen off for just a moment. What argument could possibly be made against Coca-Cola and the Centers for Biodiversity and most of the public for actually going out and hunting a polar bear? Aren't they in complete free fall, in desperate straits with pack ice disappearing and seal populations diminishing? There's a lot of emotional baggage out there. I testified to the US House of Environment a while back, and I told them during my testimony, I said, it's very logical for people to bring up pictures of cuddly polar bears. Knut the polar bear was voted the most cuddly, attractive animal on Earth at one point, until he became too hard to handle and too big, and he wasn't cute anymore. And I said, people often hold up posters. Well, sure enough, the next presenter, Barbara Boxer, a senator from California, held up posters of baby polar bears. But polar bears are interesting problem. Each year, Canada kills 470 polar bears by hunters. And you think, how can this be? Well, we support 60% of the global polar bear population. And this is carefully regulated under treaty right to the Inuit. Most of their killed are males, and that's important for population reasons. 85 to 95% are killed by Inuit hunters under the treaty rights granted out of Ottawa. Of the 5 to 15% that are taken by outfitted sport hunters, these tags are allocated from Inuit quotas. They make a conscious decision each year of how many they're going to allocate. And they do this for very mercantile reasons, to raise money. A polar bear hunt for an outsider costs somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 per hunt. And interestingly, the outfitters and indigenous guides get 70% of this money. That's important. That's really important. These are folks that don't have very many means of making outside money. Tourism, and this is a form of hunting tourism, is one of the largest. Nobody wants to feel like they're on the dole or they're just living by transfer payments from Ottawa. And to be able to earn your own way through a time-honored tradition has a lot of merit. This is crucial income that pays for skidoos, pays for gas, pays for kids' education. And interestingly, it keeps indigenous skills alive. Almost all the polar bear hunting is done by dog sleds. Dog sledding was in free fall a few years back, but now this has given it a little shot in the arm. And so people are keeping dogs again because they hunt off the dog sled. They also contend that it maintains an appropriate relationship between people and bears, which have their own entities. It also shows a certain level of tolerance. It reduces the tolerance bears have for people. They're not the Churchill bears that wander in willy-nilly, ignoring or chasing people, turning over garbage cans and being hooligans. So it reestablishes humans as being a dominant predator on the landscape rather than a fearful one that runs from a bear. A good bear is one that runs from you, not toward you. A common saying is follow the money. I'm going to finish up in just a couple of minutes. I know I'm aware of the time here. We're at 42 minutes. Where does the money go? Most of it goes to local benefits. And so this sort of shows this is not some white, rich, fat cat that's coming in and making a windfall. This is a local initiative. And interestingly, those same 460, 470 bears are going to die each year, whether it's by the bullet of a trophy hunter or the bullet of an Inuit subsistence hunter. So the bear doesn't really much care, I don't think, who pulls the trigger. Yet the repercussions of that bear's death are fundamentally different. Again, this is a treaty-agreed harvest that's allowed to the Inuit. If it's not trophy hunting, that 80% of bears that are male may be lower to cubs and sows, which is not a good thing for persistence of bears. So let's ask some questions. Is hunting polar bear such a good idea these days? Well, we know from the historical record that polar bear hunts have been going on for 9,000 years before Europeans colonized North America. So there's a precedent, and it has a very small population effect. The numbers taken are minimal. Aren't climate change, depopulation, hunting cumulative mortality factors? Possibly, but the bear range is changing with or without the hunts. In fact, if ice diminishes at the current rate it is, we may have crowding conditions, greater cub mortality, skinny bears, irrespective of hunting or not. Hunting may reduce the pressure and bring them more into line with the available habitat. Not many people realize that in 1960s, the best estimate of polar bear populations globally was 6,000 bears. And yet now with management, we're up somewhere between 22 and 27,000 bears. So over 4 times the population. They are going to be limited by habitat, not by hunting. What's an appropriate involvement of us non-Northerners? Well, that's a tough one. We probably can't know this. This is an indigenous decided relationship. And it brings many cautions of neocolonialism and the enforcement of our will on Inuit hunting policy and practice. This has been a long-term problem with caribou harvests and telling the Inuit elders how they should manage their resource in their backyard. So I really can't speak to this. I don't know. My summary statement for both of these species, polar bears and wood bison, suggests that it increases population sustainability, biodiversity, cultural maintenance of traditions, livelihood for local people, connection of people to nature, and wildlife management support. These are essentially good things, even though some animals must die to maintain these social and ecological goods. Some years back, I pulled this Gary Larson-like thing out of the paper because I thought it was funny. Battle of Marlin for $5, ha, ha, ha. Then I went to a sportsman show in Alberta, and sure enough, you could pay, maybe it's $5, maybe it's $10, to sit in a boat seat with a line connected to a computer, watch a video screen, and battle a steelhead for 5 minutes. If you pull too hard, you break off and the line goes limp. If you play it just right, you land the virtual fish. And this said to me, something is out of kilter. Why not actually go fishing instead? So we often hear the saying, let's go with the best science for making our decisions. But I'm married to an environmental sociologist, and she reminds me that the best policy is not made just by the facts. It's made by social dimensions. That means you consider participants, perspectives, values, strategies, etc. It relies on good governance. Can the laws be enforced? Do you plan this out? Do you regulate? Is it adaptive? Many other things. And the third, my field, is the environmental knowledge of the biology of the species, the air, the geology, of the conditions. If we braid these three different streams, we come out with a good, enduring, sensitive policy for how we respond to hunting, to non-hunting. All are necessary, none is sufficient alone. Okay, 2 more slides. So in North America, the cornerstones called the North American model is that wildlife is in public ownership and we have fair access to wildlife. It's never market or commoditized for wild killed game, that we regulate our harvests within the constraints of conservation to increase the viability of these species. And wildlife is not allocated just to the wealthy or just to the elite or just to royalty. We broke from that many, many years ago. It's basically an equality available to everybody. And then we use data for stewardship and management. So my last slide, and I'll open it back up to questions here, is something that Bob Remington asked me to put up. He reported on this some years back in a story in the newspaper. And it was a little placard I put, you know, the polite etiquette these days is to say if your potluck dish has got meat in it, or if it's vegan, or if it's got any nuts in it, because we care about each other and we don't want to offend or make somebody ill. So I tried to explain what my venison curry contained and why it might be worth eating. Interestingly, several of the vegetarians said, "I got to try this." It wasn't my intent, but it did make a rather pointed move. The contrast between the meat supply most of us eat versus the meat supply that a hunter might secure. So I'm going to leave this up, and I'm going to try to go back to the room now. I'm going to do this with some trepidation, but I won't turn off my sound, so I can certainly respond to comments, questions. And Dr. Robillard, I guess I'll return the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Foote. This is Melissa again.
Oh, hi, Melissa.
That was a fantastic presentation, and I really appreciated how you scored some fantastic points, but just your acknowledgement of, you know, there's two sides to every argument, and there's a way to go about hearing both of those sides, and I really appreciated that. We do have a number of questions from members of the audience, and I'll encourage them to continue to pose those in the chat. But we have about 20 or 25 minutes left in our session time, so hoping we can pose those to you and just get a little bit more insight from you.
Sure, these would be great prompts. I don't turn on my chat while I'm speaking because it's so distracting. I want to stop and talk about everything. So I'm going to try to go down and speak to a few of these.
Yep. Well, and we've collected them all. So if it's up to you, if you'd like me to read them out to you, or if you want to go through the chat, it's completely up to you.
I'm going to go through the chat. I'm going to start at the top and go to the bottom. If we get down to the first questions. You know, I will say that the land acknowledgement was a new thing to me when I moved here. And I think it's a really great founding. I think it's really important to dwell on that. It's very easy to fall into a very rote formulaic statement, just to, so you might say, to keep people off your back, to check that box. But I think it really deserves this time to stop and think about where you are, who's been here before, and what your relationship with them and the land is. Not only that, what you might gain from their perspectives on that very land. Because as you said, there's more than one side to every story. I actually think there's not just two sides. I think there are lots of sides. And I also think it's very, very difficult or very problematic to go to a binary, to one side or the other. I think we should always expand our considerations to multiple perspectives. Okay, I live in an area where hunting, trapping, and fishing are normal. I learned to take only what you need and use what you take. Don't play with your food and kill humanely. That's a really interesting catch and release criticism we hear in Yukon quite often. I work with the Trondequetchin First Nations in Yukon, and some of the elders there will say that catch and release stuff is really playing with your food, and that even made it into the hunting regulations. Take what you need and leave the rest alone, because our actions are so surprising. Most people don't realize that between 3 and 7% of all hooked fish that you take carefully off the hook and release die of secondary infections, capture myopathy, damage, stress. So it's really not catch and release. It's just a reduction in mortality. Yeah, don't play with your food. Fair enough. If we wore more hide-based products from the mass meat economy, we may have reduced the pollution to the world from fabric industry. Agreed. You know, I was tempted to wear my muskrat fur hat, which I've had for 15 years now. It's terribly warm, and I've never been able to keep a toque that long, those synthetic toques. Fair enough. I too live in a world where the harvesting of resources, including animals, is looked at and managed ethically. However, it remains divisive due to disinformation using emotionally charged language and photo representations. You know, if I were a crass guy, I'd say, deal with it. I have to as well, but I'm not. I feel your pain there, because many things are taken out of context and distorted, and whichever perspective you might hold, honestly considered, it's easy to find somebody who sees it differently and is willing to criticize. I don't do social media because my hide is not thick enough. The trolls and the flame wars are just a little too upsetting, but I'm willing to sit down with anybody and speak to them. A criticism about communication as well. I learned early on that when I do sound bites or presentations or with media, that I can be sampled, edited, and things can be taken out of context. They talk to you for 20 minutes, and if they get 15 seconds of sensational clip out of it, they'll edit that out, use that, and you can be made to look like a complete and utter fool. As David Schindler said, the best way to do this is to do live interviews where they can't edit you. And so it puts you on the hot seat, but it's a great way to have a more honest discussion and not cede the opportunity to decontextualize your words. So, great. Oh, others have used 7 generations. Fair enough. I think we agree in concept, maybe not in degree, but multiple future generations, fair enough. Define public. In what area of what demographic, and how are the views of that public confirmed? Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that one. Public is a broader sphere than yourself, for sure, but the bounds of which, is it regional, county, province, territory, continental, global? It's the great other out there. Define market hunting. Market hunting is a very interesting concept that caused the near extinction and extinction of many species, passenger pigeons, near extinction of the bison on the plains. And the market hunting came about because there were markets in the east, and there was a transport mechanism of the newly formed railways that allowed this beaver hide, bison hide, to basically be this giant sucking sound pulled into the Eastern and European markets. And it wasn't limited by the need of the individuals doing the hunting. It was feeding a larger market, people that didn't get as much protein as they want, and they could take as much as they could get. In the early part of last century, there was also an active market hunting for waterfowl, and they were killed, salted, and sold in Eastern markets. Interestingly, the trumpeter swan that used to occur continuously from British Columbia all the way to Newfoundland, swan skins were so desirable, they were hunted. It was the best insulation known to humankind, may still be. And they were hunted and put a big hole in the middle of their range. They still exist in some places, but they're slowly recolonizing their range. Who decides what a reasonable number of the population is? Is that a personal choice? It can be subjective, but there are some hard genetic markers. You want to have sustainability and biodiversity. really three different ways of setting what we call K in modeling, or population carrying capacity. There is the habitat carrying capacity, which is what can be sustained in the long term. There's the social carrying capacity, like how many mountain lions can we tolerate in the city limits of Los Angeles? There's currently 3 to a dozen that live in the fringes and the suburbs, and they're not well tolerated by people that have dogs and cats. So there's a social carrying capacity that sometimes we just say enough. We saw that with the wood bison. They didn't jeopardize their habitat, but the local people said, we don't want more than X number. And then there's a genetic carrying capacity. When populations fall below a certain level, they switch from climbing to falling, because for lots of different reasons: genetic depression, allele effects, inbreeding, things. So you want to maintain all of these. There are some markers, but really, who decides? Ultimately, that is a democratic decision that works its way ideally through the voting and the citizenry to the representatives, and pressure is brought to bear. It doesn't work that way all the time. Special interests have an inordinate voice in those decisions. That is my home province. I'm not sure where that is, Glendora. Okay, please continue to share your questions on the chat. Okay, single species management is never sustainable. Ecosystems-based management considers all species. And that's right, in a sense, much like holistic medicine is good for the entire organism of us, and it holds many of the physical ills at bay. Managing the entire ecosystem in an umbrella sense can do a lot to prevent the worst of the ills. But there are certain key species. I'm thinking recently of an article in Science about Tasmanian devils that are in Tasmania that are now suffering from a special mouth cancer that would cause extinction. They have to switch to single species management. It's not an environmental problem, it's a genetic problem within these species. Chronic wasting disease will not be well addressed by whole ecosystem management. Specific problems, to medicalize this, need specific cures. So sometimes, yes, but it's not mutually exclusive with ecosystem management. We can manage the entire ecosystem and focus in laser-like on key limiting factors as well. So I would say both, not either. By market hunting, do you mean commercial hunting, such as pinned hunts? Oh, it's funny you would ask that, Professor Remington. No, market hunting, that is a marketed commodity and an activity, and I have spoken out and written white papers opposing the hunting of pinned animals, what's called canned hunts, or fish in a barrel, or cervid harvesting preserves, which are legal in Saskatchewan, interestingly, illegal in Alberta. I think there are many, many ills that come with that, as far as breaking up the habitat with high fences, of demeaning the animals, where if you shake a bucket of corn, they come running. It lowers the integrity of the endeavor. It reduces the uncertainty. Many of these places have guaranteed kill rates. And there's a reason they call it hunting. It's not just killing. The average predator, lion, leopard, cheetah, is successful in 5–15% of their pursuits. I think failing to get an animal when on a hunting outing is equally important as securing an animal. And you have to have wins and losses to have any sense of fair chase or pursuit. So a high fenced area, shooting semi-tame animals, I think is, I find it morally repugnant. That's my personal opinion, but I also find it practically a practical wrong for the future of the animal, of hunting, and other things. Ironically, it's pretty well accepted that chronic wasting disease in deer, elk, and ultimately in caribou was propagated by captive hunting preserves with high concentrations, densities of elk. So I'm pretty much down on it. Conservation communication needs to shift from the focus on charismatic megafauna to the focus on humanitarian crises, social justice, and civil rights issues, and focus on the interconnectedness of the ecosystems. There are organisms integral to ecosystems that are overlooked for the conservation of what is cute because they are marketable. How do we encourage and practice the communication of conservation as a more holistic practice for both environment and social benefits. You know, there are people on this chat that could probably speak to this better than me. And I think there are many, many lessons to learn from the indigenous relationship with subsistence use. You probably saw from my last slide, my personal, I hunt for subsistence and meat for my family. Occasionally I kill big animals, often I kill small ones, but it's done with respect, and it's done as a removal from a natural ecosystem, and it's done in ways that change me and I think improve me, not just my appetite, but improve my relationship to nature, my commitment, my stewardship to nature. That might be part of the holism you're speaking to. But the social justice, those, I guess I do consider that somewhat of a different issue. That's a human to human relationship. It's embedded within the environment we all share. But yeah, I'm probably not qualified to go much further than that. It's an excellent question though. I do like the holistic approach. If I may share some good things I've come across, The Wolves of Yellowstone by National Geographic. Indeed, that is a wonderful story about keystone species. And yeah, I haven't seen The Biggest Little Farm, which shows how a farm survived in the California drought by using natural biodiversity in the food chain. Great. I see some new messages coming in. Thank you guys for these very insightful comments. Understanding is a prerequisite to informed disapproval. How do you begin to help people understand the practice of hunting that's steeped in the history of respect for the environment? Well, understanding, I agree. Understanding, connecting. A theologian I once read said, the first duty of love is to listen. And I think opening ourselves to other people, other ways of doing things, other perspectives, and weighing them out carefully, you might come to the conclusion that hunting is not for you, and that's a perfectly legitimate approach. It also is over time. I find that I'm less and less of a hunter-killer with time. Maybe it's dropping testosterone levels, maybe it's energy, maybe it's bad rotator cuffs, maybe it's I've done it enough. My interest is more in mentoring and showing other people the joys and insights, and the exercise, the fresh air, the uncertainty, the awe, the adaptations, the beauty of being connected to a larger system than it is doing it myself anymore, frankly. So I think that your question, understanding, doesn't just come from without, it also comes from within. Not to get too woo-woo on you here, but if we dwell on these things and think with a real open heart, we hear that term quite often, with an open heart, you'll allow this process to change you. How am I doing on time, Melissa?
We've got about 9 minutes, so unfortunately I don't know if we'll get through all of the questions, but we have until about 12:15 Pacific time.
Okay. Great. Amber's written on your slide with social dimensions, decision processes, and environmental knowledge. Shouldn't there be a consultation as the first part of the decision process? Amber, I would have looped that into the governance. Governance actually, good governance, I think, requires consultation of all interested parties. We typically create a special category for those people with long-standing indigeneity on site appropriately, but I think that that's governance. And so I think it's there, it's just buried a little bit. That was an older slide, and maybe I could make that more explicit, but thank you for picking that out. Okay, I'm gonna move down, look at a few more of these. I believe that change is needed in the way we communicate respectfully when we disagree. We have a tendency to surround ourselves with agreeable people. Echo chamber, but this limits our opportunity to grow and learn from experience and perspectives. Danny, all I can say is amen. That's an excellent point. And it's the reason that I've chosen to engage with people that I know hold differing perspectives from me. And this feedback is really valuable. Thank you for the comment. The venison curry slide showed greater sensitivity toward the deer as living creature that feels pain. Could you speak to the roots of beliefs that intelligence determines if animals should be treated humanely or not? The word that I trip on here is humanely, and I'm not exactly sure what humanely is. If it were humanly, I would say no. Humanely, I would say yes. An important distinction is the difference between animal rights and animal welfare. I'm a very strong advocate for animal welfare. The animal rights, I can't find ways to make that work in all situations. So I don't know that animals can hold the rights that are often given to humans. The animal does feel pain, and this will sound like a sidestep, but two of my friends that spent time in Vietnam that received injuries, one from a grenade and one from a rifle shot, actually made interesting observations. They said, you don't often feel a lot of pain for the first few minutes. Endorphins reduce that for survival reasons. A properly shot animal should be dead in the first 20 seconds. So I don't know the process of dying that way causes a heck of a lot of pain. They are certainly capable of feeling pain, internalizing it, avoiding it, staying away from it. In fact, an entire theory in wildlife ecology is called the landscape of fear. It says that many organisms, most higher organisms, are embedded in a landscape of risky activities. Could be predation, could be thermal exposure, and they make their decisions not going toward food or toward water so much as away from things that threaten them. So they spend a lot of time being vigilant, trying to avoid the pain you mentioned. And so if they are stressed too much, they don't forage efficiently, they don't thrive, they're in an unnatural situation. So that's an interesting concept. The pain aspect is something to be avoided. Any comments on the indigenous versus non-indigenous hunting rights? Oops, scanned up too far, sorry. And what we might see in the future. You know, one of the things I resented in Alberta was I was not legally allowed to hunt with some of my indigenous friends, because the law would see that as they who didn't require a license could be hosting me. Let me go out, pull the trigger, and then everybody in the party claim, oh, it was our indigenous hunting. He's just along to take pictures. And I really would love to know more about that. I've trapped with indigenous folks in the Peace Athabasca Delta. There's a lot. I've watched the movies. I've talked to lots of folks. I've served on boards with individuals that were indigenous. I think there's some sharing and some lessons to be learned there. And I wish that were easier to communicate, not just with words, but with demonstration and shared participation. I don't know about the indigenous hunting rights, how that's going to play out. I know there's a place for them. I would not oppose it. But folks that are selfish and want it all for me, mine, it's all for me, that tends to exclude all others and divides the hunting fraternity in a very inappropriate way. Okay, especially considering Alberta First Nations and Métis harvesting rights. It's certainly a political hot potato. They will win that in court. They, meaning indigenous and Métis hunting rights, they have won that in court, and we will get used to it. The white hunting community will make adjustments. This will all work out in the end. I always like the quote, "Time wounds all heals." People that make too big a fuss over this and are oppositional and antagonistic instead of conciliatory, accepting, and adaptive are the ultimate losers. Do you think enforcing, this is from May, enforcing animal rights and hunting concerns in the education system starting from a very early age would help stop this crisis? It used to be that hunting was taught in the public school system, and the mood of the public and also the gun fear, which underlays a lot of the opposition to hunting these days, removed it. They still have archery in the school systems of Alberta. I don't know about British Columbia yet. Yes, early formative influences. The greatest predictors of whether somebody will hunt come down to three things. Are you rural or urban? Do you have an admired mentor, typically male, historically male, but that's changing, that an uncle, a father, an older brother that would take you out hunting? And do you have access to areas to go? If those three things are met, then people will probably continue to hunt.
Dr. Foote Chase here. I just conscious of the time. We have extra time. If you wanted to continue to answer questions, we can go in, but I want to just also say thank you so much and just be respectful of your time. So I'll leave the decision to you, but we have about 3 or 4 more minutes, so maybe one more question.
Okay, we'll do, I'm trying to be fair and go in chronological order here, so I'll do one more question. I'm doing just fine. I'm gonna take a sip of coffee so my voice doesn't give out, but I'm happy to stay as long as people like to talk about one of my favorite topics. So I'll be glad to talk through the lunch hour and then hand it back for your next speaker, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine with us.
Great. And I do understand that people have to wink out and go to other things. It doesn't offend me at all. Do you think enforcing animal rights in hunting? Oh, I've already spoken to that one. You know, if I'm lucky, I'll get through all these questions. You can leave the question to answer others. However, I'll pose it. My uncle was an avid hunter and often went to the foothills to hunt elk. He would go by horseback. On one trip, a wild stallion was able to steal one of the mares. After about 2 or 3 months of returning and looking for the mare, my uncle was able to separate her from the wild herd. He felt he had saved her from a dangerous and hard life in the wild. It seemed somehow sad to me. You know, that's a really interesting comment. I'm working on a paper right now about the wild horses of Alberta. The range, it's like the hunting issue. On one side of this discussion, they're considered feral, nuisance, invaders, disease-ridden despoilers of agriculture. On the other side, the horse-loving crowd, and it's a big, very wild, well-spoken crowd, well-funded too, think that they are returning to their native homeland, a place that horses originated in North America, went across the Bering Land Bridge, went extinct in North America. We're introducing them to their native range, much like the bison story. So, and there's a budding tourism business of going out seeing wild horses. So I went out and watched wild horses. Well, I was expecting to see a bunch of nags out in the field. No, it's a pretty different organism in context. Around Rocky Mountain House, these guys there were battling bachelors, there were males with scars all over them fighting, chasing their herd of mares, and they will indeed steal domestic mares. And just like my house wolf, my dog, they carry that deep sense of how to communicate, how to forage, what the power structure is, what the dynamics are. And horse whisperers know how to tap into this and speak horse language and make horses do what other horses require of them. So yeah, it's a great topic, and it really brings individuals' values, sentiments, and perspectives to the fore. And as far as the hard life, he's right. They don't live very long in the wild compared to in captivity. A horse, it's not unusual for a horse to live 25 to 30 years on a hay diet in captivity. A horse in the wild doesn't last nearly that long, especially when there are mountain lions that specialize in horse predation. Okay, Natalie says Western science is very low context. When you start to compartmentalize subjects, such as my comments on not being able to look at things holistically, things fall apart. Everything is connected, and you cannot only look at certain aspects because what affects one affects all. I think I'll come back to this, and I think I addressed, it's a great comment. I think I addressed this earlier in not one way or the other way, but all ways. Again, the holistic overlay is a very important context for things, and that has to be considered. However, often the cure comes in the form of a pill or a management solution or something like that. We can't manage all pieces all the time for specific ills. My perspective, which might be different from yours, Natalie, is that we do both. We manage the specific and the general to the best we can. And I acknowledge that Western science is not the end-all be-all. My 3-strand rope, I think, made that clear. The governance, the consultation that was brought up, the social play out of it, and the environmental context are all really important players. We would have to have beer to solve that dispute, I suspect. Animal welfare, for sure, is the intended meaning. Yes, I think that's right, Crystal. Very different worldviews. This seems foreign to me. The view is very low context because it's limited to proven Western science research, whereas we're ever evolving, acquiring new knowledge based on our fundamental principles and values. Resources are part of us rather than something that is only used. I think we agree on this. I don't see anything in there, Natalie, that I would really disagree with. You know, Western science is a tool. It's one of many. It's why the consultation process, it's why drawing wisdom of elders, it's why the oral tradition, it's why the lived experience is such a valuable underpinning to much of that. Again, not one or the other, but all. I mean, to be, I shouldn't say this, this is trite and petty, but many of the ills of subpopulations of humans that have lived in perfect harmony are now being addressed with the tools of science and Western medicine and other things. So again, we can learn a great deal from people that live close to the land. Likewise, I hope that they can benefit some from the tools of Western science. And I'm also aware of the problems, the open pit mining, the air pollution, the water pollution, the dams. The reason I can't go catch salmon as freely as we could 200 years ago. The ills that come from Western science and development. But there are benefits in both camps, I think. Okay. Hey, I think I'm getting toward the end. Oh, 19 new messages there. I'm not getting toward the end. Going back to the question of cruel deaths, animals dying to vehicles, natural occurrence, et cetera, et cetera. Hunters don't take weak or sick typically. They seek out healthy animals. How does that help those who animals die would die naturally cruel death or even the overall health of the species? Well, interestingly, in the Journal of Wildlife Management this past year, there's been a hot debate about bighorn sheep harvesting. Are we taking the best and the prime animals and such? There is some concern there, and it's being looked at. Many of us don't take the largest animals. My typical approach is to take the first legal animal that presents itself or gives itself to me. It might be a fawn whitetail, or it might be a 4-year-old mature buck with big antlers. I mean, selfishly, I like the big ones better because there's more meat on them. But, and there isn't a small industry of seeking out just the trophy or the biggest and only, and there are bragging rights. There's a small industry built around that with magazines and sale of things. And I consider those anomalous and spurious sorts of things that will in time will address themselves. We'll get to the catch and release mentality of sustainability in the hunting field in time. I know you can't catch and release, but at least a more broad view. I really can't address much more of that though. It's pretty important for you to know that you stumped me there. I have something to say about most things, but probably not there. Corporate lip service to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, I'm not sure what diversity, equity, and inclusion I've given lip service to, but I feel it. I mean, it's my circle, it's my peeps. But
that's actually the next. It's Robert Remington here. That's actually the next session.
Oh, whew. Okay, thanks. I didn't have a good reply to that. Thanks, Bob. Good hunters work hard at their craft. Their craft is an act of reverence for nature. They take their time, choose carefully, and aim well. And I agree completely. And I would add, they fully utilize once they have killed something. I'm with you on that, Carrie. Okay. I'm not seeing any more comments. Is that a wrap?
I think you covered them all, Dr. Foote.
I don't know that I answered all the questions. There were some very insightful comments woven into the questions there. And I really thank the audience for their insights. That was a lot of fun. You really made me think there. And I hope that I was able to do the same for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being part of this, and have a great rest of your week.